For centuries, maps were treated as declarations of authority. Lines were drawn by men who believed that measurement, a lone rope, compass, sextant could tame the wildest landscapes. Blank spaces were seen as insults to reason, waiting to be conquered by ink. Yet one of the most remarkable maps ever produced did not begin with instruments or imperial ambition. It began with listening. The cartographer at the heart of this story did not set out to dominate an unmapped continent. He set out to understand it. Over the course of decades, he walked an estimated 90,000 kilometers, more than twice the circumference of the Earth, across forests, deserts, floodplains, mountain passes, and coasts that European maps had labeled as void. His journeys were slow, often solitary, and frequently misunderstood by his contemporaries. He carried tools, yes, but his most powerful method was deceptively simple. He listened to the people who already knew the land. This approach would quietly revolutionize cartography. The age of confident ignorance, the era in which this mapmaker lived, was one of confident ignorance. Expeditions were launched with rigid plans and rigid hierarchies. Explorers marched inland following straight lines on paper that had little to do with reality. Rivers were assumed to flow neatly. Mountain ranges were sketched as symmetrical spines. Vast interiors were reduced to guesses and decorative flourishes. Indigenous knowledge, when acknowledged at all, was treated as anecdotal or inferior. Guides were hired to lead caravans but rarely credited for the routes that saved lives. Oral histories were dismissed as myth. Names given to rivers, valleys, and sacred sites were replaced with those of distant patrons who would never see them. Our mapmaker began his career inside this tradition and nearly died because of it. Early in his travels, he attempted to cross a semi-arid region using only colonial charts and astronomical measurements. The maps promised water sources that did not exist and ignored seasonal changes that transformed passable ground into deadly traps. After days without reliable water, he was found by local inhabitants who knew exactly where the hidden springs lay when they dried up and which plants could sustain a traveler. They did not just save him. They reshaped his worldview. He realized something unsettling. The land was already fully mapped, just not on paper. Walking as method, and like many explorers who traveled quickly to claim territory, this cartographer walked. He walked because walking forced intimacy. On foot, distances feel honest. Slopes reveal themselves. Wind patterns become familiar. You learn which valleys funnel storms and which ridges offer safe passage. Walking slowed him down enough to notice that the land was not static but alive, changing with seasons, rituals, and memory. Over time, he abandoned the idea that maps were primarily visual objects. Instead, he began to treat them as translations, imperfect attempts to render lived knowledge into lines and symbols. He spent long periods living with indigenous communities, sometimes months at a time, learning local languages well enough to understand place names. These names were not arbitrary labels. They encoded information: where food could be found, where floods reached, where ancestors were said to walk, where spirits were believed to linger. A bend in a river might be named for a fish that only appeared during certain moons. A hill might be named for a sound the wind made when storms approached. To ignore these names, he realized, was to ignore the land's own instructions. Listening as science, what made this cartographer unusual was not simply his respect for indigenous knowledge, but the rigor with which he treated it. He cross-referenced oral accounts from different groups, noting where stories converged and where they diverged. He compared seasonal narratives with physical evidence: sediment layers, vegetation patterns, animal migrations. Over years, patterns emerged. Routes described in songlines, oral maps embedded in music and story often followed the most efficient paths between water sources. Sacred boundaries frequently aligned with ecological transitions. Stories of dangerous spirits clustered around unstable terrain, flood-prone areas, or regions with toxic plants. This was not superstition. It was environmental intelligence refined over thousands of years. He began to annotate his maps not just with coordinates but with commentary. Impassable after heavy rains. Water reliable only in dry season. Safe crossing known to locals. These notes baffled officials who wanted clean, authoritative documents. To them, uncertainty was weakness. To him, it was honesty. 90,000 kilometers of trust. Figure of 90,000 kilometers was not achieved through one grand expedition, but through countless journeys stitched together over a lifetime. He revisited regions repeatedly, sometimes decades apart, to see how landscapes changed. He corrected his own mistakes. He erased lines that proved misleading. He added routes he had once ignored. Crucially, he credited his sources, at least privately. In his journals, indigenous informants were named, their explanations recorded in detail. While colonial publishing conventions often strip this credit away, the original notes reveal a map shaped by many minds. There were costs to this approach. He was criticized for moving too slowly. Funding was inconsistent. He was accused of going native, of abandoning the objectivity expected of a European scientist. Yet his maps, when finally compiled, were uncannily accurate. Later surveyors with modern instruments confirmed river courses, mountain alignments, and routes that his work had already captured. He had mapped not just geography, but relationships. Maps that changed policy. The practical impact of his maps was profound. Safer travel routes reduced fatalities. Settlements placed using his environmental notes were less prone to flooding and crop failure. Conflicts decreased in regions where his work acknowledged indigenous boundaries rather than erasing them. Ironically, this made his maps more useful to colonial administrations than many of the bold, speculative charts that preceded them. Precision born of humility outperformed confidence born of ignorance. Yet the deeper legacy was philosophical. His work challenged the assumption that knowledge must be extracted to be valid. Instead, it suggested that knowledge could be shared if the listener was patient enough. Modern science catches up today. Modern science is finally validating what this mapmaker practiced intuitively. Fields like ethnogeography, traditional ecological knowledge (TEK), and participatory mapping recognize that indigenous knowledge systems are not relics of the past, but sophisticated, dynamic sciences. Satellite imagery confirms migration routes long preserved in oral tradition. Climate models increasingly rely on indigenous observations to understand long-term environmental change. Conservation efforts succeed more often when local communities are treated as partners rather than obstacles. In this light, the mapmaker's true achievement was not the distance he walked, but the intellectual distance he crossed from domination to dialogue. The unfinished map. No map is ever complete. Landscapes shift. Rivers change course. Human relationships with land evolve. The cartographer understood this better than most. Near the end of his life, he reportedly refused to call his work definitive. He described it instead as a listening in progress. That phrase feels radical even now. In an age obsessed with data, speed, and authority, his legacy reminds us that some knowledge cannot be rushed or owned. It must be earned through attention, respect, and time. The continent he mapped was never truly unmapped, it was simply unheard. By choosing to listen, he proved that the most powerful tool a mapmaker can carry is not a compass or a ruler, but humility.